Hello and welcome back, friends. My name is Kari, and today I would love to share with you my family's go-to everyday sandwich loaf. It is sourdough, it is 100% whole wheat, it is soft, and it is such a wonderful everyday bread. So let's go ahead and get into it. So I have 1,000 grams of freshly milled whole wheat flour. You can buy the store-bought whole wheat flour as well. Next we have 700 grams of milk, 240 grams of a fed and active sourdough starter. You can use whole wheat or regular starter like I'm using, as well as 113 grams of butter, 113 grams of honey, and some salt, about 7 to 10 grams of your choice of salt. So you do not have to use a mixer for this. You can absolutely do this by hand. It's just going to take a little bit more time since you're doing it manually. But how I like to do this is I throw in my wet ingredients first and then I add in my flour. Now my milk here is fresh from the fridge, so it is cold. If your ambient temperature is on the colder side, feel free to gently, very gently warm your milk just so that it's lukewarm instead of cold from the fridge. That way your starter doesn't have to work as hard to go ahead and get going for that loaf. And yes, I made a giant mess with the honey. So just keep that in mind. If you are using an electric mixer like I am using though, I like to just keep the milk cold because the mixer itself will gently warm the dough up, and I don't want my dough to be too warm. You want it to be cool, not super warm to the touch to where it's going to be over fermenting very quickly. So, and the butter is also just barely warmed up just for ease of mixing. So I'm just going to give that a mix. It's not going to be perfect. I'm not worried about that. After this is gently incorporated, I'm going to dump in all of my flour. And if you're doing this by hand, it is going to take at least 5 minutes of kneading this into a somewhat smooth ball. It's not going to be a perfectly smooth ball because this is 100% whole wheat after all, but it's going to have a little bit of tackiness to it, but overall it will be smooth. It won't be super sticky. That's the goal. That's what we're looking for. So on an electric mixer like this, it takes maybe 2 or 3 minutes on medium. So on a 2, for this is my machine. However, if you have a different machine, just keep it on low or medium low. Should do the job for a few minutes. And it's worth saying, I normally make a quadruple batch. This recipe is for 2 loaves of bread. Just for the sake of this video, I wanted to show that. However, if you have this mixer, at least, this is the Bosch mixer. It's great for bread. It can make up to 4 of these loaves in one single batch. So that is huge for me when I am in the kitchen baking all week long. I don't want to have to keep making bread and turning on my oven for an hour just to make 2 loaves. I want to pack it in there. So normally I do 4 of these loaves in this mixer, and that works out great. This is what it should look like when it comes together into a ball. It's pretty smooth. It's just got a slight tackiness to it, but it's not sticky. So once we're at this point, we're going to go ahead and take our dough and we're going to let it sit. So we're going to put it in a separate bowl and we're going to keep it covered so it doesn't dry out. And we're going to do 3 stretch and folds. If you have mixed this by hand, I would maybe do a little bit more time with the stretch and folds. I'll tell you about that when we get to that later in the video. But for now, just pop it in a bowl, let it get covered, and let it sit for 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been 30 minutes. I'm going to come back to this and do my first set of stretch and folds. Because I did this with the machine, I'm only going to do 1 round of stretch and folds, which means I'm going to just gently tug at the dough on each side, bringing it in over onto itself. And I'm going to do that for 1 full round. But if you did this by hand, I recommend you do a little bit more stretch and folds, so maybe do 2 rounds of stretch and folds instead of just 1 on each side like I'm doing here. I end up folding the dough over on itself 4 times, and maybe you need to shoot for 8 times if you've mixed the dough by hand, just to give it a little bit of extra support there. But again, time is really the important factor for getting the nice cohesive ball of dough that we're looking for. Once you've done that, we're going to pop the lid back on and we'll come back again in another 30 minutes. So this is the second round of stretch and folds that I'm doing. Again, just going and gently picking up the side of the dough ball and pulling it over onto itself, trying to not tear the dough. That's why I'm sort of shaking it out, if you will. We're not trying to rip the gluten when we're doing this. And you will find it might be a little bit harder than your normal all-purpose flour dough because of that wheat, that whole wheat that we're working with. So don't worry if it feels a little bit harder to work with, because it'll all come out fine in the end with just some patience anyways. And it is worth mentioning that my ambient temperature here is about 75 to 76 degrees. So you're going to have to adjust your overall bulking period as such. If you have a cooler house, it's going to take a longer time. If you have a warmer house, it might be shorter time. So just keep that in mind as we go along this process. So this is the final stretch and fold that I'm going to do for this. I am a busy mom with kids and homeschooling and activities and things, so you can do another round of stretch and folds if you feel like it needs to. Like if you mix this by hand and you feel like the dough isn't quite as smooth as you would like it, then go ahead and you can always add in another stretch and fold. Adding another 30 minutes to the bulking time is not a big deal if you feel like it needs it. Because I did this with the machine, I'm not worried about that. 3 stretch and folds I feel like is adequate enough to help my bread out and give me that rise that I'm going to want in the final product. So after I've got my last stretch and fold done, I'm going to pop the lid back on and I'm going to let this bulk ferment for 2 to 3 hours. Again, this is very dependent on the ambient room temperature. It could take 4 hours. Just keep in mind that you're looking for it to about double. It doesn't have to be exactly perfectly double, but about. It helps if you have a picture actually. If you're not really used to doing sourdough and eyeballing it in the bowl that it's in, take a picture and then come back to it and you can always compare it to your picture and see if it's gotten to double. Okay, so now I'm just going to kind of gently shape it so that it's easier to eyeball the half point here, because I'm going to divide this into 2 loaves. And now we're going to shape the loaves. And I do not do a bench rest here. You can always let it, from this point after you've cut them, just sit there for 10 or 15 minutes to help everything kind of relax a little bit and be easier to shape. Like I said, I'm a busy mom. I just want to get on with my day, and I feel like it doesn't really affect the end product as much, so I skip the bench folds. And so now I'm going to just shape the dough into a rectangle. I want a long rectangle because that's essentially going to be the length of the loaf pan that they are going to go in. And you don't want it to be like too short that there's still like 6 inches of the loaf pan that hasn't been filled with the dough. You don't have to be super perfect with this, but just try and make it longer than you would anticipate, because the way that we fold it, we want to make sure that we fill in those loaf pans adequately so that we don't have a big old gap. So we're kind of almost like laminating it, if you will. Like we're gently pulling, we're not tearing, and you'll notice I kind of shake it out a little bit. Again, just using that sort of shaking movement so that I can pull the dough without tearing the dough. And then we're going to fold 1/2 into the center, and then we're going to fold the other half over that. And then we're going to roll this up from the side. And it's going to create like a little cylinder, if you will. And so I'm just going to pinch the sides and I'm just going to kind of tighten things up so that we don't have any weird explosions in the oven. So I'm just pinching both ends to kind of close them up, and then I'm going to use some surface tension to sort of just close the seam at the bottom and get a nice smooth shape, a nice smooth dough to put into our loaf pans. And you can sort of pinch the bottom seam if you'd like. You don't have to be perfect about this, but it does help to kind of have a nice smooth ball, and make sure you try and get out any air pockets. If you have air pockets, try and puncture those as gently as you can. You don't want any weird things happening in the oven, especially since it'll be sitting here for another 2 to 3 hours bulking. So that helps to keep a cohesive shape, which is always nice, but definitely not necessary. The bread will still taste fantastic either way. The great thing about this loaf is that you can prep it and bake it all in the same day, as long as you start at about 8 or 9 in the morning, then by the afternoon, your dough will have fermented and bulk risen enough that you can go ahead and pop it in the oven and have fresh bread that day. Or after you have shaped your dough into the loaves, you can put those in the fridge covered to bake off the next day. I like to just do it the same day because I don't have a whole lot of room in my fridge because I like to bake 4 loaves at once. So having a bread done the same day that I started it is really convenient for me, and it generally is very forgiving. So as long as you're just keeping your eye on it and it's not like 85 degrees in your house, or on the other hand like 50 degrees in your house, you can absolutely bake this the same day as long as you get started in the morning. Okay, once we have both of our loaves ready, we're gonna cover them, and again, we're gonna let these sit for another 2 to 3 hours. For me, this ended up being 2.5 hours. But you're gonna just want to look for that, again, that double in rise. It helps, again, to take a picture and just kind of compare it as the day goes on. And again, you're just gonna have to eyeball it and see when is the right time for you. And it might just take some practice as well with your own temperature and your own flour that you're using. All right, so this is after 2.5 hours of sitting and proofing, and you can see they have risen substantially. They are over the lip of the containers, and that's always a good indicator that it has risen enough to go ahead and get in the oven. And I did end up putting a little slit on either side of those just to help control for any explosions. Sometimes it's not even necessary, but I went ahead and did it just in case. And so there we have it. 100% whole wheat sourdough bread loaf. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.